It was supposed to be just another shift, another quiet, uneventful night in the ICU. The sound of heart monitors, the soft beeping of machines, and the familiar rhythm of routine tasks filling the air. Nurse Rebecca Moore was no stranger to pressure. She had spent years working in critical care, surrounded by the kind of chaos and urgency that others couldn't begin to imagine. But tonight felt different. It wasn't the alarm that suddenly blared through the room that caught her off guard. It wasn't the rush of frantic footsteps from colleagues running toward her. No, it was the moment she heard the voice that came behind her as the alarm screamed louder, the voice that told her, "You're under arrest." Rebecca froze. Her eyes locked on the handcuffs that appeared out of nowhere, as if they were an everyday part of her shift. But this wasn't the ordinary chaos of the ICU. No, this was something else, something darker. What could possibly lead to this moment? How could a nurse who had given her life to saving others, who had been the one to fight alongside doctors and colleagues, now find herself handcuffed in the middle of a shift? As she stood there, confused and helpless, the hospital's ICU monitor suddenly went crazy. Vital signs flashing wildly, alarms blaring louder, and a sense of urgency like nothing she had ever felt before. And just as Rebecca tried to make sense of it all, the ICU doors swung open and the real truth started to unfold in a way she could never have anticipated. But what happened next would leave everyone in that hospital questioning everything they thought they knew about what had just happened to Rebecca. Was she the victim of a mistake, or was something far more sinister at play? Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to subscribe to ensure you don't miss any of our upcoming mind-blowing stories. Now, let's get into the story. The night had been quiet, too quiet. Rebecca Moore had always prided herself on being able to handle the chaos. She had worked in the ICU long enough to know that emergencies could spring up at any moment. But tonight, everything felt oddly calm. No major accidents, no critical admissions, no doctors rushing around in a frenzy. Just the steady rhythm of the heart monitors, the soft hiss of ventilators, and the occasional quiet chatter between nurses. It was the kind of night shift she had come to expect during the late hours. Routine. Predictable. The clock read 2:43 a.m., and the hospital felt like it was in a state of suspended animation. Rebecca had just finished checking on Carla Jensen, a longtime patient who had been in a coma for over a week after a car accident. She adjusted the drip on Carla's IV and recorded her vitals. Everything seemed stable. Everything seemed normal. But Rebecca couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. There was an unease in the air, a tension that wasn't visible on any monitor or in any chart. It was something deeper, something instinctual. She shook it off. The exhaustion from the long hours on her feet was starting to catch up with her. She grabbed a quick sip of water from the break room, trying to push the uneasy feeling aside. But as soon as she stepped back into the ICU, she heard it. Beep, beep, beep. The loud, sharp sound of an alarm filled the room, cutting through the silence. Rebecca's heart skipped a beat. It was Carla's monitor. Carla's vitals were dropping. Rebecca's training kicked in immediately. She rushed to Carla's side, her hands moving quickly as she adjusted the IV, checked the oxygen levels, and read the numbers on the screen. The alarms were deafening, each beep getting faster as though the monitor itself was urging her to act faster. But something wasn't adding up. Carla's vitals were fine. There was no reason for this alarm. Her numbers had been stable for hours. Rebecca checked again, her mind racing. Was it a glitch? The machine malfunctioning? She looked to her right. That's when she saw it. The clock read 2:47 a.m. The chaos had begun. Rebecca's thoughts raced as she hit the emergency button, calling for the rapid response team. As she worked, trying to steady Carla, the alarm seemed to grow louder, more persistent. The sound was starting to get to her. But before she could catch her breath, another sound followed, the unmistakable voice of Officer Charles Hawkins as he entered the room. "Rebecca?" Hawkins said, his voice deep and steady as always. Rebecca didn't look at him at first, her focus still locked on Carla's readings. "Hawkins, this is bad. Carla's vitals are dropping for no reason. Something's wrong," Rebecca said, urgency in her voice as she worked to stabilize the patient. Hawkins, standing by the door, didn't move. "Should I call for backup?" he asked, his voice calm, but Rebecca could hear the concern in it. Rebecca didn't answer right away. Instead, she stepped back from the patient's side for a moment, staring at the monitors. Something about the situation felt off. It was as though the very air in the room was thickening. And then, out of nowhere, the alarm stopped. It was as if the ICU had been holding its breath. Rebecca blinked, her heart still racing, trying to figure out what had just happened. She took a few steadying breaths, looking at the machines again. Everything appeared fine. Hawkins moved closer. "Is it over?" he asked, his tone filled with cautious optimism. Rebecca didn't know how to answer. It didn't feel over. Not at all. Suddenly, without warning, a sharp voice cut through the stillness of the room. "Rebecca Moore." The voice was cold and it didn't belong to anyone in the ICU. Rebecca spun around to find a uniformed police officer standing at the door, his hand on the doorframe, eyes focused on her with an unsettling intensity. "Yes?" she asked, her voice faltering slightly. "You're under arrest," the officer said flatly, his tone icy as he reached inside his coat and pulled out a set of handcuffs. Rebecca's heart nearly stopped. "Under arrest?" she repeated, disbelief flooding her voice. Before she could process what was happening, the officer moved toward her, the cold metal of the handcuffs glinting under the fluorescent lights. "You've got to be kidding me," Rebecca whispered, stepping back. Officer Hawkins looked at her with a stunned expression. "Wait, what is this? What's going on?" he asked, glancing from Rebecca to the officer. The arresting officer didn't respond, simply stepping forward to place the handcuffs on Rebecca's wrists. She stood frozen in place, struggling to make sense of what was happening. This wasn't a prank. This wasn't part of the job. No one had ever warned her about something like this happening. Before she could get a word out, another officer entered and they started pulling her out of the ICU. "Wait," Rebecca exclaimed. "What's the charge? What's happening here?" The officer remained silent as they guided her toward the exit. But then, just as they reached the door, a loud alarm echoed through the ICU again. It wasn't the same alarm from earlier. This one was different, a sharp, urgent, screeching noise. All three of them froze. Rebecca's heart skipped again. "What is that?" Hawkins asked, glancing at the monitor that had triggered the new alarm. The screen flashed red, the numbers all rising at once. Suddenly, a voice crackled through Rebecca's earpiece. It was the head doctor from earlier. "We need you back in room 306 now. It's critical." Rebecca looked up at Hawkins in shock, but the officers didn't let her go. "We're not done here," one of the officers said. But Hawkins wasn't having it. He looked at the officers, then back at Rebecca. "This is a mistake. You need to let her go now," he said firmly. "She's needed here, not elsewhere." But before the officer could respond, the ICU alarms intensified, the sound deafening as the team inside scrambled to stabilize Carla. Rebecca felt her chest tighten. "Carla's not okay," she said, her voice now frantic. "I need to get back in there." The officers paused, looking at one another. It was clear there was something more going on, something that Rebecca wasn't being told. And as she was led down the hallway, all she could think about was the alarming sound coming from room 306 and the rising sense of dread deep in her gut. What had happened to Carla? And why had she been arrested at all? The room seemed to be spinning, the weight of confusion pressing down on her as they walked. the smell of disinfectant, the loud footsteps echoing down the long hallway, and the unanswered questions in her mind. Before the night was over, Rebecca would discover the shocking truth about what was really happening inside that ICU. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered as the officers escorted Rebecca Moore down the sterile hospital hallway, her heart pounding with a growing sense of confusion and urgency. What was going on? She had been a nurse for over 10 years and never had anything like this happen to her. She was the one who saved lives, the one who had seen it all: death, trauma, despair. But this was beyond comprehension. Her wrists felt cold as the handcuffs pressed into her skin, the metal biting into her with every step. Her mind raced. Why was she being arrested? As they passed through the hallway, the distant sounds of alarms echoed from the ICU, cutting through the quiet hum of the night shift. The constant beeping of heart monitors, the metallic clinks of doctors' shoes on the linoleum, all blended into a backdrop that felt almost surreal. Her eyes flickered toward room 306, where she knew Carla Jensen lay in a coma, fighting for her life. She had seen the numbers on the monitor earlier, numbers that weren't supposed to dip so low. Something was wrong, but what? She tried to speak, her voice quiet and strained. "Please, you don't understand. They need me back in there." The officer beside her gave a dismissive glance. "You'll have time to explain later." But Rebecca's mind wasn't focused on her arrest. It was on Carla. The alarms, the beeping, the rushed footsteps, it was all spiraling out of control. Every second she was away from that room, she felt the weight of the ticking clock, counting down to whatever was about to happen. "Please," she tried again, the desperation creeping into her voice. "Let me go. I have to go back." She stopped in her tracks, but the officer's grip tightened. "Keep walking." Rebecca closed her eyes for a moment, trying to calm herself. She knew there had to be a reason for this. The situation wasn't just about her. Something bigger was happening in that ICU. Minutes earlier in the ICU, Carla Jensen's vitals had worsened rapidly, and Rebecca hadn't been there to intervene. The alarms started blaring, louder and more urgently than before, sending the entire floor into chaos. Inside room 306, the medical team scrambled to stabilize Carla. The attending physician, Dr. Sophie Ellis, was at the foot of the bed, urgently pressing buttons, looking at the monitor in confusion. The readings were flashing red. This wasn't normal. The patient had been in a stable coma for the last few days, but now, this was something else. "What's going on?" shouted Sophie to her team. A nurse, Samantha, rushed over with the crash cart. "Her heart rate's plummeting, Dr. Ellis. It's not responding to the meds." Sophie's face tightened with frustration. "Increase the IV fluids, push the dopamine, and someone checks the catheter." Samantha nodded, swiftly performing the necessary actions as Dr. Ellis looked on, her brow furrowed in concern. Carla's breathing became more erratic. With each passing second, it seemed like her condition was deteriorating beyond what they could control. The monitors beeped frantically, creating an urgency that filled the room like a thick fog. In the hallway, Officer Hawkins, who had been nearby assisting with the family's situation, stood frozen by the door. He could hear the chaos through the glass and had a growing suspicion that something was very wrong. The officers led Rebecca down the long corridor, her heart still racing. She could barely process what had just happened. How had she gone from working a normal shift to being handcuffed and dragged away? It made no sense. Then her phone vibrated in her pocket. Her heart skipped a beat. It was a text from Samantha, one of the ICU nurses. "Rebecca, get back here now. Something's wrong with Carla." Rebecca's stomach lurched. Her mind flashed back to earlier, the way Carla's vitals had dropped, the strange alarm, the pressure on her chest. "Get me back there," Rebecca snapped again, her voice demanding this time. "You have no idea what's happening. They need me in there." The officer leading her down the hallway didn't respond, But Hawkins, who had been trailing behind them, finally spoke. "Rebecca, listen, I don't know what's going on either, but we can't just..." But his words were cut off by the loud ringing of the ICU alarms, growing louder as they approached. Rebecca's pulse quickened. Was it too late? Had they already lost Carla? Without warning, a loud crash sounded from the ICU room. The door to the unit slammed open and another nurse rushed out, wide-eyed. "There's no pulse," the nurse shouted. "We need a code blue in 306, stat." The words hit Rebecca like a ton of bricks. She turned and pulled against the officer's grip. "I have to go," she cried out. "You don't understand. I'm the one who's been in charge of her care." Hawkins stood motionless. His gaze flickered between Rebecca and the chaos at the ICU. The arresting officer gave a sharp tug on her arm. "This is a mistake. We can sort this out later." But Rebecca wasn't listening anymore. Her legs pushed forward, and before the officer could stop her, she tore free, darting toward the ICU door. Hawkins hesitated for a brief moment, then followed after her. But just as they reached the entrance to the ICU, a loud crash echoed from inside. It wasn't the sound of equipment. It was the sound of something breaking. Room 306 was in chaos. The crash came from a machine that had been knocked to the floor, its wires tangled on the ground, sparking. Dr. Ellis and the medical team had their hands full trying to save Carla, but it was clear something more serious was happening. Her heart had stopped beating. "Shock her," Dr. Ellis ordered, her voice sharp. The team moved swiftly, rolling the crash cart toward the bed. A defibrillator was placed on Carla's chest. Rebecca could hear the urgency in the room, and as much as she tried to push through the chaos, the officers had caught up to her. They stopped her just outside the door. "Rebecca," Hawkins shouted, grabbing her by the arm again. "What's happening in there?" Rebecca's eyes were glued to the scene unfolding inside. She could see them working tirelessly to revive Carla, her own emotions warring within her. She was needed. They needed her expertise. Her voice barely escaped her lips. "I don't know, but I know I'm the one who should be in there." Just as the team prepared to give Carla another shock, the monitor gave a long, continuous flatline sound. Rebecca's chest tightened. "No, no, no!" Dr. Ellis paused, staring at the screen in disbelief. Then, turning toward Rebecca, she asked, "Do you know what's causing this? She was stable only hours ago." Rebecca took a deep breath, her mind racing. This wasn't just another patient. This was Carla Jensen, the young woman who had come to the ICU after a car accident, the same woman whose family had been visibly distraught and asking questions in the waiting room. But now there was more at play here. Something was wrong, but what? The sound of footsteps approaching interrupted Rebecca's thoughts. Hawkins stepped in front of her. "You need to tell me what's going on, now. What aren't you telling me?" Hawkins demanded, his voice filled with both urgency and frustration. Rebecca turned to Hawkins, a fierce look in her eyes. "I don't know exactly yet," she said, her voice calm but filled with resolve. "But I have a feeling this isn't just about the crash. I think someone is targeting Carla." The harsh white lights above flickered for a brief moment, adding a strange sense of surrealism to the chaos inside the ICU. Rebecca Moore stood just outside room 306, heart pounding, chest tight, her mind spinning with a million questions. Every instinct screamed for her to push through the doors and help, but the officers had effectively blocked her path, leaving her standing there, helpless. The officers had kept her from reaching Carla. They'd handcuffed her. But the one thing Rebecca could not ignore, the one thing that kept her from falling into despair, was the sound of the alarm blaring from inside the ICU. The crash cart had been rolled out. The sound of the heart monitor flatlining had broken her concentration. But even then, the situation wasn't over, not by a long shot. From behind the door, she could hear the muffled voices of Dr. Sophie Ellis and the medical team calling out to each other in panic. They were still fighting to save Carla, but there was something in the air that Rebecca couldn't shake off. The air was thick with tension. Why was Carla's heart rate dropping so quickly? Why wasn't she responding to treatment? Rebecca's gaze remained fixed on the ICU door. She couldn't take her eyes off it. Each second felt like an eternity. She could hear the rushing footsteps of doctors, the scraping sound of metal crash carts, the shout of urgent commands. And in the back of her mind, a disturbing thought surfaced again. What was really happening to Carla? Just as she opened her mouth to speak again to Officer Hawkins, the unmistakable sound of a phone ringing cut through the noise. It was Hawkins' phone. He pulled it from his pocket and answered with a few words Rebecca couldn't quite make out. He turned toward her, his face etched with unease. "It's the family," he said, his voice tight. "They're asking questions." Rebecca's mind raced. Carla's family? Were they finally going to get answers about what happened to their daughter? Why was Carla's condition suddenly deteriorating so rapidly? But before she could question anything further, the door to room 306 swung open. Dr. Ellis stepped into the hallway, her expression serious but also showing signs of exhaustion. She wiped sweat from her brow, her eyes shifting between Rebecca and Hawkins. "She's stable, for now," Dr. Ellis said, but the strain in her voice was clear. It was far from a reassuring statement. Rebecca felt a sense of relief, but only momentarily. For now, the words echoed in her mind, but she quickly focused on the next part of the conversation. "What happened?" Rebecca asked, stepping closer, her voice hoarse with concern. Dr. Ellis glanced back into the room briefly, ensuring the team was still managing the patient. "We gave her another round of meds. Her vitals seem to have normalized, but this situation isn't over. We don't know what caused this sudden drop, but we suspect something external." Rebecca's pulse quickened. "External?" she repeated, barely able to keep the rising panic from seeping into her voice. "What do you mean? What happened to her? Was it sabotage?" Dr. Ellis didn't respond immediately. Instead, she turned her gaze toward the hallway, clearly considering her next words carefully. "We're still running tests, but I have reason to believe that someone tampered with her treatment." A chill ran down Rebecca's spine. Tampered with her treatment? "Do you think someone on the staff did this?" Hawkins asked, stepping closer, his eyes narrowing in suspicion. His grip on his phone tightened. "I don't know," Dr. Ellis replied slowly, her eyes locked on Rebecca now. "But there's a chance the crash wasn't just the result of the accident. The car crash that brought her here might not be the full story." Rebecca's mind reeled. What was Dr. Ellis saying? Was there something more to Carla's condition than just an accident? Before Rebecca could ask another question, the door to room 306 slammed open again. This time, Samantha, another nurse, stepped out of the room, her face pale and worried. She quickly approached Dr. Ellis, her voice shaking. "We've got something else. You need to come see this." Dr. Ellis turned sharply, her face hardening as she followed Samantha back into the room. Rebecca stayed behind, watching them disappear back into the ICU. She felt a surge of frustration. This wasn't over. It couldn't be. Not like this. She turned to Hawkins. "What are they not telling me?" she asked sharply. "Is there something else happening in that room? What was it about the external factors?" Before Hawkins could answer, a loud crash rang out again, this time from deeper in the hospital. The walls seemed to shake with the force of it. "What was that?" Rebecca exclaimed, her eyes wide with alarm. She started walking toward the sound. "Stay here," Hawkins said firmly, but before he could stop her, Rebecca was already heading toward the hallway, her body moving on instinct. But she had no idea what was waiting for her. 2 minutes earlier, in the surveillance room of the hospital, a different scene was unfolding entirely. Hidden from Rebecca's view, a security officer named Alan, a young man in his mid-30s, sat at his station scrolling through security footage. He was used to watching the usual footage: nurses walking between floors, staff changing shifts, visitors entering and leaving. But something caught his eye as he scans the monitors. A woman in the hospital hallways had been acting strangely. She had arrived earlier that day, unassuming, walking alone. At first, Alan hadn't thought much of it, but after a few hours, he noticed something peculiar. She had been wandering the halls, not staying in any one area for too long. Her movements were too deliberate, her presence too quiet. Alan clicked into a different footage window, zooming in on the mysterious woman. The woman was Carla's mother, but she hadn't arrived with anyone. She'd been walking in and out of various parts of the hospital, often disappearing into areas where she shouldn't have been. Her behavior had seemed off from the moment she walked in. Alan checked the timestamps and started to piece things together. The moments she entered certain areas were right before major events began to unfold. Carla's sudden crash, Rebecca's frantic need to return to the ICU, the alarms. Alan's eyes widened as he connected the dots. Was it possible that Carla's mother wasn't just an innocent family member? He grabbed his phone quickly, dialing the hospital security line. The words spilled out before he could stop them. "There's something you need to know. I think I've found the connection." Inside the ICU, Dr. Ellis and Samantha were now examining Carla Jensen once again, but this time, the tension in the room was even thicker. Something had changed in the atmosphere. Rebecca's feet took her closer to the door once again, but this time, she was not stopping. What was happening to Carla? She couldn't wait another minute. She pushed through the door. The medical team froze as she entered. Their eyes darted to her. Dr. Ellis's voice was strained. "Rebecca, you need to leave. This is a dangerous situation now." But before Rebecca could respond, the alarms blared again, louder than before. Everything was spiraling out of control. The vital signs were now flashing red. Rebecca's hands moved instinctively to the monitors, but nothing made sense. The numbers were wildly fluctuating, erratic, as if something had taken over the machine itself. Samantha grabbed her arm. "Rebecca, you need to leave now." Rebecca pulled away from her grip. "I'm not leaving." Then the unthinkable happened. The heart monitor suddenly flatlined. The crowd gasped. Rebecca's heart stopped. The crowd was already rushing the hallways, whispers echoing through the air. Who had tampered with Carla's treatment? And more importantly, why was Rebecca being set up to take the fall? Rebecca's breath was shallow as the monitors continued to beep wildly, the noise now echoing in her ears, nearly drowning out every thought. The flatline had been more than just a malfunction. It had been a warning. Her hands, still trembling from the adrenaline, hovered above the emergency buttons as her mind raced. The urgency of the moment pushed her body into autopilot, but there was a part of her that couldn't stop thinking. Who was behind this? Dr. Sophie Ellis, looking increasingly frustrated, barked out commands, her face pale under the stark hospital lighting. But the room felt strangely detached, almost like it was happening in slow motion. Rebecca turned to look at Samantha, a nurse she had worked with for years, who was standing frozen, unsure of what to do. "I've never seen anything like this before," Samantha whispered, her voice shaking. "We need to stop the bleeding, but it's like everything's just crashing." Rebecca's thoughts flickered briefly to the strange feeling she had earlier that day, the one that had gnawed at her all night. It hadn't been just about Carla's condition. There was something more sinister at play. Someone had been tampering with her treatments, and Rebecca had been blind to it. She should have seen the signs earlier, but now, standing in the middle of this chaos, she could feel a sense of betrayal in the air. It wasn't just about Carla anymore. It was about something much larger. Before she could ask Dr. Ellis about the tampered medication, another nurse rushed into the room with an urgent message. "Rebecca Moore," the nurse called out, her voice panic-stricken. "There's a problem outside. The police have surrounded the hospital. We've got officers questioning the staff." Rebecca froze. Her heart dropped. The handcuffs, the arrest. It was all falling apart. The scene outside the ICU had escalated rapidly. Police were now everywhere. The hospital, which had once been a sanctuary for healing, had turned into the scene of a criminal investigation. The air was thick with confusion, and Rebecca's mind was still trying to piece together what was happening. The police officers who had arrested her were still standing by, their expressions cold as they exchanged whispers with hospital security. And the more Rebecca tried to make sense of it, the more certain she became. She was being framed. The realization hit her hard, but there was no time to stop and reflect. The situation demanded action. Rebecca was ushered down the hallway, her thoughts racing. She was handcuffed again, but this time there was no escape. The officers didn't seem to care about her explanations, until one voice cut through the tension. "I need to speak to Rebecca Moore." Rebecca froze. The voice was unmistakable. It was Sophie Ellis, the head physician. She had been in the ICU with Rebecca just moments ago. Now, Sophie stood at the end of the hallway, her expression serious and grave. She was accompanied by a few security guards, but her presence alone seemed to hold authority. The officers paused, exchanging confused glances, but the cold, unwavering look in Dr. Ellis's eyes told them to back off. "I said," Dr. Ellis repeated, her voice firmer, "I need to speak to Rebecca Moore." One officer stepped forward, visibly irritated. "She's under arrest. She can't talk to anyone." "I don't care," Dr. Ellis shot back, her voice sharp. "I need you to release her, now. This is beyond your jurisdiction." The officer hesitated. It was in that moment that justice began to shift. Rebecca had been arrested for a crime she didn't commit, but what was about to happen was even more unexpected. The truth would come to light. Dr. Ellis turned to Rebecca, her expression softening, though her tone remained strong. "You're not the one who's responsible for what happened to Carla," Dr. Ellis said, her eyes filled with both sympathy and anger. "The tampering with her treatment, it wasn't you. It was someone in the family, Carla's mother." Rebecca's breath caught. Carla's mother. Dr. Ellis nodded gravely. "We had suspicions about the treatment plans for days, but we couldn't prove anything. It was her. She changed the medication doses, thinking it would make a difference in Carla's condition, but all it did was cause her organs to fail." Rebecca's mind raced. So the arrest, was it a mistake? The police were called because of the situation in the waiting room. Her family accused you of mishandling Carla's care, but that was never true. I've been trying to tell them, but they wouldn't listen. Rebecca shook her head, the realization hitting her like a freight train. She had spent the entire night thinking she was the one at fault. Now she was learning that everything she had feared, the framing, was real. As the weight of the situation lifted from her shoulders, Rebecca's hands fell limply at her sides. She looked up at Dr. Ellis, still reeling from the shock. "I didn't know," Rebecca whispered, her voice cracking with emotion. "I had no idea what was happening. I thought I was doing everything right." Dr. Ellis placed a hand on her shoulder, offering a moment of quiet comfort. "You were doing everything right. It wasn't your fault." Rebecca swallowed hard, the sense of relief washing over her slowly, like the first breath of air after being submerged underwater. It wasn't her fault. But even as the truth unraveled, Rebecca knew the repercussions of the chaos were far from over. There was still Carla's family to deal with, still the emotional toll the incident had caused everyone involved. The hospital's reputation was hanging by a thread, and Rebecca knew there would be more questions, more scrutiny. But she wasn't going to let that stop her. As the night began to settle and the bustle of the investigation started to fade, Rebecca found herself sitting in a quiet hospital room, still in handcuffs but now free in her mind. She had faced a battle, both externally and internally. In her years of experience, Rebecca had seen the darkest sides of humanity, the greed, the desperation, the disregard for others. But tonight, she had learned something vital. Truth has a way of coming to light even in the darkest moments. It wasn't just about what had happened to Carla, or the arrest, or the chaos. It was about the integrity that was preserved, the honesty that shone through in the midst of lies and deception. Rebecca had fought for what was right, even when the odds were stacked against her. Sometimes, even in the face of adversity, standing your ground is the only path to redemption. What do you think happened that night? Do you think Rebecca will ever fully recover from this experience, or has her life as a nurse been permanently altered by the truth that came to light? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe for more real-life twists and stories that will leave you thinking long after the video ends.
And if you thought this story was unbelievable, wait until you hear what happened in the next case.